Good evening. It's a delight to be here. I want to thank the Foundation and Abu Dhabi for extending such a warm welcome. And thank you all for taking time out of what I'm sure is a busy day and early evening to come and speak with me this evening. I'm here to talk about, there we go. Oh, there we go. That's my title. I'm sorry. I'm here to talk about creating a healthy environment for young children, strategies for promoting nutrition and physical activity in our very young children. I am hoping that this is an interactive opportunity for us, so while I will be giving information and giving tips along the way, I'd like to stop every now and then to hear your feedback and to hear your stories and to hear how you think some of the things that we're discussing might be integrated into your families and your communities. There we go. I want to tell you a little bit about myself to start. I think possibly my most important credential is that I have 3 young children. I have a 7-year-old daughter and 2 boys, ages 5 and 2. So when I say I am in this struggle with you, I really am there. If you've had a feeding struggle, I've probably had that feeding struggle. My children all came to me with very different temperaments in every way, and that included their interests in food and their preferences, their sort of innate physical activity levels, their interest in screens or disinterest in screens. And so I've learned a lot from my research and learned a lot about thinking about how I apply that to my children. I'd like to ask a little bit about those of you in the audience so I get a sense of the kinds of things that you're working with right now. How many of you, and I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to see hands very well, but I'll do my best. How many of you are relatively new parents? How many of you have infants? Infants or toddlers? Anybody have very young ones? So a handful. So this is fantastic because one of my main messages, the earlier we can start with some of these strategies, the better off we are. It's always easier to just start on the right track than to have to shift gears. So that's fantastic, and I'm glad to have all of you here. Parents of preschoolers? Any parents of preschoolers? Or teachers of preschoolers, teachers of infant, toddlers, preschoolers? Wonderful. How many have sort of school-age, early school-age children? Okay. How many have adolescents? And I'm tremoring a little bit in fear of adolescence with my daughter. So some adolescents. So while I'm focused very much, and I know this series is on early childhood, most of the advice that I will have about feeding and will have about getting kids active and setting limits actually is applicable across the age span. So I'm hoping those of you with teens will find that you can take some of this information and make it useful in your homes as well. How many of you have more than one child? So you'll have the experience of thinking, this was my first child who did this, and what on earth is this other child doing? And how did both of these very different children come out of me? Anyone have that experience? Yes, I have that myself. How many of you have had struggles with feeding in your families? Only a handful. I have to raise my hand. Struggles with feeding. I have had struggles with feeding my children. And I'd like to get a sense of who handles feeding in your families. How many of you, mom is the primary person who makes decisions about what is eaten and how that's handled? Raise of hands. How many are in families where the father makes the decisions about what's eaten and how that's handled? Other family members making decisions about what's eaten in the family? Maybe aunts, uncles, grandparents. That's very common in the US, is that we have multiple caregivers. And then maybe other non-familial caregivers feeding children. Okay, so a real mix. That's great, and I think one of the things that is important to recognize is that we often have many people feeding our kids, and that can make it hard to really work on one track of strategies. Let's see. I'm going to talk a little bit about why I'm focused on food and physical activity. This has become my research passion, my life passion. Early habits, eating, physical activity-wise, and weight, we know track into later childhood, into adolescence and adulthood. So the more likely we are, when we have an overweight child, we know that child is more likely to be an overweight adult than a thin child is. And the same, as I said, for some of the nutrition habits. Poorly nourished and inactive children do not learn well. We have clear data on this. So if we're interested just even in the learning portion and not as much in the health, we know that it affects learning, and that's really key. Obesity and lifestyle-related diseases can have a major economic impact. So if we're thinking about economic impacts in our communities and our countries, we know that and I can say that the US is a cautionary tale for this one. We are paying billions and billions of dollars every year on lifestyle-related diseases, and that's definitely a problem. We see a lot of lost work productivity due to diseases related to poor nutrition, sedentary lifestyle, and obesity. And finally, reduced quality of life. We have been measuring this for many decades, and those who struggle with these lifestyle-related morbidities related to nutrition, physical activity, have reduced quality of life, and they just don't get as much out of their lives as they might otherwise. So very key. I wanted to tell you a little bit about some of the common questions I get when I'm speaking with parents and others in the community. And then I wanted to hear if there's anything missing from this list, because I want to make sure I address everybody's concerns. One question I get a lot is, how much should I interfere in my child's eating? Is that a question some of you have? I think we're often taught that we should let them alone, that they will just eat the things that they need. Have people heard this advice? If we just leave them to it? I have certainly heard that advice. That's a question I get. Another is, how do I handle my picky eater? How many people have come here and struggle with picky eating themselves, have a picky eater in their family? I have one of my 3 is a picky eater. We also get the question all the time, well, isn't everything okay in moderation? Can't we just eat everything as long as we just eat them in reasonable portions? And I think that's a question many people have. How many have had that question come to mind? A few of you, okay. I get asked a lot about soda, how much soda is okay? How people have that question, isn't a little bit of soda okay? How much should be okay for my young child? I also get asked the question, aren't all children naturally active? If we just let them alone, won't they run around as much as they need to run around? And that's a question I'm asked a lot. Others are, what if my child is not athletic? What am I supposed to do about this child? How do I get a non-athletic child active? Another question, what if I don't like physical activity personally? You're telling me that I need to be active with my child, and I actually don't even like it. It's not fun for me. I'm asked that a lot. I'm also asked, why are you talking about television? You're supposed to be talking about nutrition and physical activity, and why are we talking about television, and why are we talking about computer use and that kind of thing? And I do get asked also about the role of computers in early education. And I want to take a minute now, and I think I have someone willing to take a couple of notes. I want to hear about some of the other questions you came to this workshop with. And I think we have someone here ready to, Eleanor, I think, can pass around the mic. I'd like to hear the other burning questions that you've come with, so we make sure that we cover those.
Hi.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
I'm just curious about, how do I put this? Making them want something more by telling them they can't have it. For example, chocolate. I mean, should I say no? I mean, should I let her have it every once in a while so she doesn't crave it more when she sees other people having it, etc.? Or sugar generally, for example.
Right. Terrific question. So is this going to backfire? If I set limits, is it going to backfire and make them desire it and then eat it when they're not around me? Great question. Other questions? Anybody else? We'll make sure to get to that.
Yes. Is there a way in which parents can instill some system of self-discipline in children when it comes to saying yes or no to a food that's offered to them?
Right. So am I going to have to follow my child around until he leaves home and make those decisions? Or how do I get from making those decisions for my child to having this independent, healthy eater? That's a great question as well. We'll make sure to cover that. Other questions? I think I see one over here, hand up over here.
Hello?
Hi.
It kind of ties in with my friend's question. Along the lines of, hamburgers and french fries and chicken nuggets and kind of everything that's fast food or, plus sugar. If I kind of restrict that in my child's diet, how does that psychologically affect them maybe in later years? Like when they go to school, will they feel like an outcast? Will they feel, psychologically like they're missing something? as well as how does it, backfire?
Right. So is there going to be, and there's been a lot of concern about that. So when we talk about doing programs or doing any kind of limiting, that's always a concern. Are we going to create some kind of disturbance around their eating attitudes, is
Yeah,
what we
'cause
refer to it.
I can limit what's in my house, but when they go to a party, for example, and they have food that I might not favor, but I'll allow her to eat maybe, once in a while, how does that make her feel?
Right.
Does,
Is she going to feel bad about it?
Yeah,
and then feel
exactly.
bad about herself? That's an excellent question, and certainly I'll try to incorporate that into the talk. Any other burning questions? And we can actually add to this list as we go if others come up as we are going through the topics. Any others right now? If I don't see your hand up, please just wave really wildly, and I think Eleanor will see you. Okay, well, I'll carry on to my next slide. I want to introduce a concept that you may or may not have heard of. The concept is optimal defaults. And this is really a big take-home message from me to you about how to think about setting up the environment for healthy behaviors. I use it as applying to nutrition and physical activity and some of the related behaviors that we're going to talk about, but you can kind of use it to apply to anything that's a desirable behavior for your child or for adults as well. The idea here is that we want the healthy choice to be the easy choice, and the unhealthy choice to be something you have to go out of your way to engage in. And I think my next slide is going to show you, no, you know what, I'm going to skip here and come back. So this slide won't make a whole lot of sense when you're looking at it. I'll walk you through it a little bit. This here says lunch line redesign. And this is an example of redoing how a school cafeteria works. So in the United States, we've been spending a lot of time thinking about how to revamp school food programs so that children are getting healthy food in school. The point of showing you this is really to illustrate optimal defaults. So there are many points in this lunch line where we can make small changes that will nudge children toward a better behavior and nudge them away from a less desirable behavior. So it's all about, so if we want them to eat healthy foods, we stock it with primarily healthy foods and don't ask them to don't put out the healthy and unhealthy and then say, please make the healthy choice while you're staring at the really delicious but unhealthy food here. We might place the healthier things closer to them and make it really hard to get at the unhealthy. So for example, if we want them to drink the unflavored milk rather than the flavored and sugary milk, we might put the sugary milk buried at the back of the cooler and make it really hard to get to. So they really have to go out of their way. We might show fruits and vegetables under really attractive lighting, rather than, many of you will not have been through a U.S. school lunch line, but they're not known for their aesthetic appeal. They're not known for making kids really want to eat the fruits and vegetables, but you can set them up so those things look desirable. So this is I show this really to give you an example of how we might set up our communities, our institutions, and our homes. So if we want them to be eating the healthy foods and engaging in the healthy behaviors, we want to make it really easy for them so that they don't have to make a hard decision to do the right thing. I'll back up a couple of slides. I want to talk a little bit about what influences diet. There is this idea out there that we respond to our internal cues, that we eat when we're hungry, and we stop eating when we're full. And it is possible that there was a time when we did that. But in our current environment, that is by and large not what happens. Study after study after study shows that we are heavily influenced in our intake by portion sizes. So adults and children as young as 3 and 4 years old will just eat more if you put more on their plates. So as an example, studies have shown that children tend to eat 75% of what is on their plate. If you double the portion, they eat 75% of that portion. They just eat 75% of what you put on their plate in some of these controlled studies. So we know that portions really matter in even very young children. Plate size matters. We eat more the larger the plate is. And so if you want to decrease the amount you're eating, buying smaller dinner plates is kind of a key strategy to use. We are heavily influenced by taste. We are biologically predisposed to really like fat and sugar. This is part of how we've survived as a species, is to seek out calorically dense foods. So this way we didn't starve over time. Now we're in an environment where most of the world is unlikely to starve, but we are likely to encounter diseases that are negatively influenced by too much fat and sugar. So our biology is not working well for our environment. We also tend to eat what is available. There have been lots of really neat studies done on, if you just move something 10 feet away, we're pretty unlikely to eat it. And if I could do this study on myself. If I put the candy jar at the other side of the room, I'm unlikely to go out of my way to get it. If it's sitting on my desk, I'm really likely to partake of it during the day. So that's key. And convenience and ease. We are in an increasingly busy and stressful society, so we tend to eat the things that are convenient, and the things that are harder to prepare and time-consuming, and never mind complained about by our children, tend to be more difficult for us. This cost is an issue worldwide, and it plays out differently in different countries, but it is much more likely for people to buy things that are cheaper. It makes economic sense when feeding our families. We are also heavily influenced by promotion and marketing. I'm going to talk a lot about that today because it really influences all areas of children's health and well-being. But make no mistake about it, marketing affects us. Some colleagues of mine at the Rudd Center where I work have done studies on people's perception of influence of marketing. That's a bit of a mouthful. So let me explain what I mean there. Most of us think that marketing influences other people's decisions, but not our own. And everybody thinks that. So we all think, so I think it affects you, but not me. You think it affects me and not you. But make no mistake about it, that's why so much is spent on marketing. It heavily influences our decisions. And so if you take a look at this list, you realize that our internal cues just can't compete in this world. That's why it's so important that we're setting up our environment to really be a successful place for eating, physical activity, and others. I'm going to stop for a minute and see if anyone has any comments or questions right now. What I've talked about, I've had quite a few mouthfuls here. Anybody? Okay, I'll carry on past that. I'm going to talk a little bit about what makes up a healthy diet for a young child. And it's not real complicated. We recommend that about half of a child's plate be fruits and vegetables, ideally whole fruits and vegetables rather than juices. About a quarter of it be grains, typically whole grains. A quarter of it be lean protein, and then for some reason dairy always gets fobbed off onto the side, but that might be usually low-fat dairy in the form of milk or yogurt or cheeses. And just to expand on that a little bit, we like to see varied fruits and vegetables and whole grains and lean proteins. I think I've mentioned that. And especially a focus on limiting added sugar and fat, especially saturated fat and trans fats, and salt. And there is very little room for extras in a very young child's diet. If you think about how much a young child can actually get into their system, I mean, those of you who have young kids, they just don't eat all that much at one time. So there isn't, by the time we actually meet their nutritional needs and hit those, recommended amounts of different vitamins and different kinds of groups, food and beverage groups, we don't have a lot of room for those extras, and I think that's key to remember. So as an example, we've sort of worked this out on American kids' diets, and by the time you feed them 1.5 small cookies, you're done with extras for the day, even if you do well with everything else. So it's just not a lot of room for extras. We really need to focus getting that good nutrition into them. And the other point I'll make here is that one of the biggest ways to improve the nutrition quality of a child's diet is to reduce or eliminate packaged and processed foods. Most of all that extra fat, salt, and sugar, most of it comes in packaged and processed foods. We certainly can see it in our home-cooked meals, but it's ubiquitous in some of these packaged and processed foods. And the other thing that's difficult about it is that often those things are hidden in those foods. So how many of you eat pasta and pasta sauce? Any of you enjoy pasta sauce? Okay, I do. When you buy pasta sauce from the grocery store in a jar, it's full of sugar. And that's a little bit surprising because we don't think of it as necessarily a sweet or a dessert, but it's full of sugar. So my point here is that these kinds of the ingredients that we're trying to avoid just really hide in some of those foods. If I can if I was to give one takeaway on what to eat or not eat for children of any age, I would say eliminate sugary drinks. Sugary drinks, in some studies, have been shown to be the single greatest contributor of sugar to diets of children and of adults. Sugary drinks carry absolutely no nutritional value, so they don't add anything to the diet. And you can't say that about many foods. Usually you can say something redeeming about most foods out there. They add something, they contribute some food group to the diet. Sugary drinks contribute absolutely nothing. And I will talk more about sugary drinks later. It's a real tricky thing with early childhood. We used to think about sugary drinks as just being soda, so carbonated Coke, Pepsi, 7-Up, that kind of thing. But sugary drinks have really expanded into other categories, and I think much of the time, we as parents and caregivers don't realize that drinks have added sugar, and I think that's an important thing to focus on. Another recommendation, and I think this is a little bit U.S.-centric, so I'll take this with a grain of salt. It's often recommended that children have several small meals or snacks over the course of the day because they don't eat a lot at one time. But there are also cultures where there's not a lot in terms of snacking built in, so that can be fairly culturally specific. I want to stop now and ask for anyone who'd like to talk about how do these recommendations mesh with your typical diet? Any thoughts, any feedback on that? Just raise your hand and someone will bring a mic over to you. I mean, does this sound very different from typical diet? I see a hand up here.
Hi. I don't give my daughter, and she's like 1.5. I don't give her any sugary anything, really,
Right. Mm-hmm.
if I can help it, which includes juice.
Right.
But I also wanted to know, we ourselves are slightly on the paleo diet,
Right.
and I kind of wanted to know about dairy. I've heard, we don't take any,
Sure.
we don't go with dairy,
Yeah.
cheese, milk, anything. But that also includes for our daughter, if, we've heard basically that the child doesn't need dairy, and it's basically the U.S. kind of government and, I guess the people behind dairy who are kind of pushing it
Right.
in schools and what
Yeah.
they learn about, good nutrition and everything.
Yeah.
That and grains, like, is it better to do it with whole wheat, or does it really matter?
Yeah, well, I'll address the grain question first because I think it's a little bit briefer. So I would recommend that children have grains in their diet. It used to be recommended that a large portion of their diet be grains, and that's been really scaled back in recent recommendations. As much of grains as can be should be whole grains, and really getting away from any of the refined grains, the white flour kinds of things. But it is recommended that children, it's also recommended, I know paleo is a big fad in the US right now too. Hasn't had a lot of research behind it so far, but if it bears out like all of the many, many, many fad diets that preceded it, will probably look very similar to how all other plans have gone out, which is it can be sustained for a period of time, and then it can be difficult to continue that diet. But I will address the dairy, and I think you're absolutely right. So I think that it's very clear that the U.S.'s recommendations for dairy are about twice that for other Western countries that do actually consume dairy as well. And I'm with you. I think it's heavily influenced by the dairy lobby in the U.S. I would agree with you 100%. I think the dairy, but let me say that I also think the dairy recommendations are there, especially for children, because in the U.S., children do not consume a lot of other things that have calcium in them. And this is untrue for other countries. So there are many other countries where the diet consists of lots of other calcium-rich kinds of foods, and they don't eat dairy, and they have wonderful bone health. So Japan is a fabulous example of this. They very little dairy consumption, but they have very adequate calcium consumption and very good bone health. So a couple of things. I agree with you about the dairy lobby, and they are very strong. I recently completed a study on chocolate milk, and believe me, the dairy lobby came after me like crazy. around the whole chocolate milk issue because they want everyone to drink chocolate milk, which has all sorts of issues. But I think with a diet that isn't getting other sources of calcium, dairy can be an easy way to get that into a child. But if you have other good calcium-rich foods, like lots of the fishes and lots of the leafy greens that contain good calcium, then I think you could certainly forego it. So it's an excellent point.
She does take dairy now. We give her cheese, milk, all that.
Right, yeah.
But later in life, a lot of people are kind of lactose intolerant.
Right. So yeah, people do absolutely. So there are certain ethnic groups that tend to be lactose intolerant very early on, and many people do develop sensitivities to that over time as well. So you're absolutely right. Some of us are able to continue to eat dairy and choose to do that, and others can't. And there are lots of other sources of calcium, and that's an excellent point. Yeah.
Just a quick follow-up question, since we're on the topic of dairy. You were mentioning low-fat dairy, but at the same time focusing on unprocessed foods.
Right.
So I'm a little bit confused about, because there is this idea that any kind of skimming of dairy makes it processed.
Right.
But at the same time, it's really high in fat if you don't. So I don't know what to do, to be honest.
So I probably wouldn't include the skimming of the fat in my mental picture of processed food. I wouldn't be thinking about it that way. But you're right. Technically, it is interfering with the natural product. So I just would not be thinking about dairy in that way. That having been said, cheese is a pretty processed product, and you want to limit that. I mean, for the fat content as well as for the sodium. There are two non-processed. Well, I guess cheese is processed, but there are two major sources of sodium in children's diet, and cheese and bread are primary ones. And this doesn't mean you shouldn't eat them, but watch the sodium content. You can get lower sodium versions of both, or if you're making bread, watch the sodium content. So there are definitely reasons to limit that. But I in my sort of picture of process, wouldn't probably include the lower fat milk.
Okay, so even a 2-year-old, I should switch to low-fat milk as opposed to whole milk.
The recommendation is at 2 to switch. The recommendation for children between the ages of 12 months and 2 is to continue to drink the whole milk as supporting brain development. They need that additional fat in their diet. So unless there is some pediatricians will switch children at a younger age when there is a very strong family history of obesity and that child looks like he's on a difficult trajectory. But for most healthy children, we would recommend that they stay on the whole fat milk until they are 2 years old. Yeah.
If I can just ask you one more question about something you said earlier. So my 2-year-old has actually lost weight in the last couple of months. I'm not sure why. So I'm really interested in something that you mentioned, that if you just increase the amount of food on her plate, do you think that would work with a 2-year-old? If I just put more food in front of her, she'll finish 75% of it?
I would say that the studies that show the 75% are really with ages 4 and up. So I'm not sure what would happen. With the very young kids, sometimes they can get a little freaked out by large amounts. What we would recommend usually with a child that we were concerned about their weight, and children go through different growth trajectories, so they can be slimmer or less slim, and that can be part of normal development. But what I would say is you can either increase the bulk or you can increase healthy calorie-dense foods. So if your child is able to eat nuts, and I know some can't, to increase sort of nut content, avocado, things that are calorically rich, but with healthy fats and other healthy products is what I would suggest. I have a question down here.
Just speaking on the topic of dairy, what would you recommend? Would you recommend like cow's milk or goat's milk or camel's milk? There's so much dairy to choose from.
Right.
What would you recommend giving a child? What would be the healthier choice?
I have to say I'm a little bit out of my element here in the UAE. We don't have access to camel's milk, so I'm not well versed in that. And many parts of the U.S. don't even have the access to goat's milk. I don't have a good answer for you, but I am happy to research that question and happy to follow up with you.
Thank you very much.
A question I have not had before
Very
about
good.
camel's milk.
There's a first for everything.
There is. I think I'm going to move on to my next slide so that we keep going. I talked a little bit about extras and about how if we want our children to be eating a well-rounded, nutritious diet, there just isn't a lot of room there's not a lot of room in anyone's diet for extras, to be honest. The number of calories that we have available to expend on extras, unless we're professional athletes, is pretty small, but especially for young children because of their lower caloric needs and their high nutritional needs. We consider extras to be foods that are high in fat and saturated fat and trans fats, or salt and sugar, and that are not contributing a whole lot to your diet. So nuts would not be in that category. They would be considered not an extra, just a good contributor of healthy fats. But this is where we're talking about our French fries and our sweet treats and our bags of chips or crisps and that kind of thing. What are some examples in your community of these extras? I'm sure I'll hear something that I've not heard before, and I'm excited about it. Who can? Over here, some common extras. I think we're waiting for a mic, or you can try, and I think we need to wait for the mic just so our translator can catch everything.
Most of our desserts seem to be doughy, fried, deep fried, drenched with sugary syrups.
Okay.
They're mostly bread or made out of flour and ghee and butter.
So some double whammies, so the high fat and the sugar all rolled into one. Okay, so some of your traditional desserts are just in the, and most people's desserts, I have to say, meet this requirement as well. So to speak a little more about extras, so limiting extras, why and how. I want to give you permission as parents. It is okay to set limits. And I know we had a couple of questions talking here about if I set limits, what will happen. So I want to expand on those issues a little bit here. Research actually does not show that there will be this backfire, that if we set appropriate limits, that children will go on to eat, want to eat that all the time. I have done some studies, school-based studies, where we limit offerings of extras in schools to almost nothing. And we have measured children's intake when they leave school, and they do not tend to make up for that when they go home or when they are on their way home, which is usually where they get their extras, at the corner store for us. So we have some data to suggest that we don't have that backfire that everybody is concerned about. But I also think there are a couple of limits to these data. One thing I will say that is if children have to look at it all the time, they're going to want it. So the best way to limit extras is to just not have it in the house when you don't want them to have it. And this is not to say you can't have those extras, but have them in the house when it's time to have them, and then don't have them around. And then you also won't have to have an argument at home about it. How many of you have struggled with this? No, we can't have this right now. Have a big carry-on about it. I have certainly had that. And so making the decision at the grocery store gets rid of that. It's just not in the house. And it also doesn't create that temptation, that constant reminder for the child that it's here, but I can't have it, and I'm staring at it, and I can see it in that see-through jar, or whatever it is. So we know that we don't see the backfire as long as we don't keep reminding children that they are being, deprived, in quotes. I think it's, as I said, it's okay to set limits. Decide on a limit that works for your family. I'm asked all the time, well, how many extras should we have? It should be once a day? Should it be once a week? Should it be 3 times a week? And I think that will vary on what works for your family. I have a colleague who, and I'll say there's no data to say this is the right pattern. I have a colleague who, in her family, it works to have a small dessert every night, and everyone looks forward to it, and they all have that. Now, in my house, when we have a small dessert every night, my children eat a small portion of their dinner and sit and wait for the dessert that they know is coming at them. So in our house, that doesn't work out very well, and we just meet out our treats a little bit differently to work for, our family style and what has worked for my children. So I wish I was able to say, this is going to work for your family. You might have to try a few things. But to set limits and to have those be family limits, I'll say a little bit more about this later on, but often we make limits for a child struggling with weight, and those limits don't apply to anyone else in the family. Have people had that experience? That's really hard for everybody, and it gives really inconsistent messages. It gives the message that there's something the overweight child has done wrong. It gives the message that it's fine for everybody else to eat junky food if they're not overweight, and that simply isn't true. Thin children can develop lifestyle-related diseases, and we need to just remember that. So find the limits that will work for your family, but it's okay to set limits. And there will be much more limit setting in the next talk in the series as well, generally speaking. And the other thing I will say is that children, we were just speaking about this earlier in a small group. Children come into this world with kind of different interest in food. those of you who have, some of you who have multiple children will have had this experience. Some kids really find food very rewarding and they're very interested in it. And others can sort of take it or leave it. So, you might have one child who, as soon as he's had enough to eat, leaves the dinner table and wants to go play. And you have another child that until the food is finished, he or she is sitting there thinking about it and wants to keep eating. How many of you have seen that either in children you care for or children in your family? Seen those differing? Yeah, and so the biology, we don't really understand all of what is operating in that biology, but what you do need to understand is that some children need a little bit more help setting their limits than others. And I think this spoke to a question that was brought up here. So I might have a child who I need to remind, well, let's take a break now and check in. Are we full? Have some water. Let's think about it. Or if you're still hungry, why don't we try to have more vegetables instead of more of the higher calorie food if this is a child who really struggles with limit setting. And it's okay to know that about your child and to respond by helping that child in a very positive way to set limits. As I said, I'm going to speak a little bit more about sugary drinks, and we used to only have to worry about soda, carbonated beverages. Now sugary drinks have expanded, I think, worldwide into all sorts of other categories. We have all sorts of sweetened teas. We have all sorts of energy drinks. Are energy drinks a big thing here? They're a big thing in the US, and there are some data actually that suggests that they can be very dangerous for children. So I'll make that note here. Energy drinks, I just put a big X through it and never bring them into your home. And try to keep them out of your schools and other venues. They are a growing problem. We have the sports drinks. Are those very popular here? The Gatorades, the sugary things that if you walk around the block, you suddenly need a sports drink. Is that common here? Not so common. So we have such a wide range now of these drinks that are just essentially added sugar and water. The thing, and these are problematic for children of all ages, and I would say for children of all ages, limit these as much as you can. Few children need a sports drink unless they're participating in pretty heavy-duty sports. Water is typically, unless they're losing huge amounts of huge amounts in perspiration, water is the best hydration. Another reason to not give sugary drinks is we want children to hydrate with things that aren't sweet. If we get them into the habit of wanting sweet things, they won't desire the water, they won't desire the unflavored milk, and they will get into their palates will be craving sweet kinds of things. And there are data to show that this is not a good trajectory. For young children, our biggest danger are what they call fruit drinks. How many of you encounter these fruit drinks? We think they are fruit juice because they have fruit in the title. Most of them have very little fruit juice in them and are maybe a couple percent weight of fruit juice and water and sugar. How many of you see those around, see young children drinking them here? A handful of you. This is a huge problem in the US, and if you haven't got it here yet, you will have it soon. And the biggest problem with this category is they're not clearly labeled. So parents often purchase them thinking they are actual 100% juice, which we recommend limiting anyways, but that they are not. So this is really a buyer beware issue, that these juice drinks are, and these are the things that the young kids will get into. They don't much like the sports drinks because they taste funny, and they don't like the carbonation because it doesn't feel good going down, our little guys. But they do love these juice drinks, and parents are often really deceived by the juice drinks. Last couple of points about sugary drinks. There is a clear association with increased weight in sugary drinks. So as I said, if there's one thing to remove from your diet, if you just want to set one goal for your children and for your family, it would be to decrease or eliminate sugary drinks from your diet. We tend not to compensate for the calories in liquid. So usually if we eat additional calories in food form, we might eat a little less later in the day. That doesn't work the same way with calories that we take in liquid form. So calories in liquid form operate a little bit differently. They fool our bodies. So they tend to just be added on calories in the form of sugar rather than part of the regular caloric diet. And I think I've made all of these other points, except for the fact that they also will displace important nutrients. So if your children are filling up on sugary drinks, and especially little ones with small stomachs, and they say, I'm full now after that, and they've taken in nothing that's nutritional, and it's sort of edging out the other important nutrients. And I think we've taken a little bit of a poll here. How many would say sugary drinks are a problem in your community for children? Yeah, okay.
they're marketed for them. They have the little characters on the
They
little juice
are.
boxes. Yes.
They're so fun.
And they're cool because everybody brings one then.
Who wouldn't want it?
Yeah.
What's the most popular character here for little guys?
I just know they have little characters on them. Yeah.
Which ones? Which characters? Do you have Dora? Dora on the
Yes.
boxes? Do you have Sesame Street characters? Although they actually have taken their characters off of unhealthy foods now. It's their new pledge. Yay, Sesame Street. So absolutely. I'm going to talk a little bit more about marketing, but I'm so glad because that's a very helpful segue.
Because I manage nursery schools and I see so many of these juice boxes and I hate them
Yeah.
with a passion.
Right.
I
And are
really
you
wish they
speaking
would
about 100% juice or
No,
also
the
about fruit
sugary
drinks?
ones.
Yeah, and I'll say a word here while I'm at it. So that, yeah, the juice drinks are really insipid in that we don't understand what they are most of the time. But I would also say while I'm at it that we recommend really strict limits on consuming even 100% fruit juice. It's always better to feed children the whole fruit. They're getting the fiber, they're getting the other nutrients. Again, their bodies aren't fooled by the liquid calories. And when we feed them juice, it tends to, again, encourage them to hydrate only with sweet things because juice is sweet. So certainly juice is better than a fruit drink, but we recommend actually for very young children not having more than 4 ounces a day. That is a quarter of a cup of juice. That's like how much I might, sip to sample. It's a very small amount, and you can do that in any way you like. Some parents like to sort of stretch that out and water it down, so children consume a little bit of watered down juice, and you can do that in different ways, but I think that's a helpful limit to have for juice. I want to talk a little bit about food as a reward, and I want to start by asking, how much does this happen in your community? Do we reward with food? Reward good behavior with food? Reward accomplishments with food? Show of hands if you see that happening in your community. Yeah. It's a very big problem in the United States right now, and it has been a problem for many years. I am a clinical psychologist by training, and I think that my discipline is actually responsible for this problem. We were the ones that set up all of these behavioral schedules where we recommended people reward and incentivize good behavior in children. And back when we didn't know any better, we told them to do it with M&Ms and Smarties and the like. So I'll apologize that we set this up. But I do want to take you through, and you may think, well, what's so bad about it? And it's really, food is a fantastic reward. It's intrinsic. So we don't really have to train kids to think of it as rewarding, but I do want to take you through some rationale for getting away from food as a reward. And there's certainly a movement, back in the US and I would say globally to move away from this for a variety of reasons. One is that children learn to prefer food as a reward. So if they didn't already like it, they really like it now that we've said it's rewarding. So ice cream was already good, but now that ice cream is the big treat when we accomplish something, it's really good, and study after study has demonstrated this. It also reinforces high sugar and high fat food preferences, so linked to that first point. It also it trains children to eat when not hungry, so it's time to have a reward, let's eat, instead of are we even hungry before we embark on the reward food, and that is problematic. And it goes on to the next couple of points here, which is the last point. It's associated with food and weight struggles in later life. So adults who report having had food used as a reward in their lives are much more likely to have struggled with weight in their future years. And we don't want to set children up to do that. And teach them to self-reward with sweets, because those adults also have learned to reward themselves with sweets. And I certainly never do that. I'm sure none of you ever reward yourselves with sweets either. I want to move on to talking about vegetables. Are vegetables a happy event in your homes? How many have children that eat vegetables beautifully? Excellent. And how many have struggles over vegetables? Yeah, I have some of each. So I have veggie eaters and I have veggie complainers, and had the experience of both. And I have actually spent a lot of my research career thinking about how to get kids to eat vegetables. And why focus on vegetables? One of the reasons for that is that it is the most disliked food pretty much globally by children. If they're going to not like a food, it's usually those more bitter vegetables. And young children especially have pretty, what we call acute or sensitive taste buds. So it is true that those bitter vegetables that taste a little bitter to us actually taste quite a bit more bitter to them. So this is really, if you can use this strategy that gets kids to eat vegetables, that is a good strategy. It will work on almost any other food that you want to try it on. So I want to give a few tips from the body of research that my colleagues and I have carried out on getting kids to eat vegetables. My best recommendation is to serve vegetables when children are hungry, and this may be a really obvious one, but we're much more likely to find food interesting and tasty when we actually have an appetite. When we're not hungry and we don't have an appetite, we will only really be interested in our favorite foods. But when we have an appetite, suddenly many more foods taste good, and I'm sure many of you have experienced that. But making sure that children arrive at the vegetable eating hungry is very helpful. We also have done some research to show that when we are trying out especially new vegetables that we know are not our kids' favorites, for us that tends to be things like cauliflower, it's some of the more bitter greens that just have really take some getting used to. If we can pair them with another food that we know the child likes, so we can get kids to eat most things in the United States if we put it on pizza. Now, I don't recommend you serve pizza 3 times a day, although you can certainly make healthy pizzas, but that you get the idea, is that there's a food that they already have a positive association with. Those will vary across child and vary across homes, but it's something that they already like, and we just kind of slip this new one in, and they develop a positive association. We also have found that they are likely to eat vegetables when we don't have them compete with anything else. So if we serve vegetables as part of lunch versus serving it as a standalone snack, they eat twice as much at the snack. And I think you think about it, first we were very shocked by this finding, and we thought, well, there's nothing else to eat. What would they eat? I mean, if they're hungry, that's all there is. So it makes a lot of sense, but we have done study after study to demonstrate that. And then finally, how many parents are not vegetable lovers? How many are willing to? No one wants to put up their hand. Say this. Well, I won't make anybody put up their hand, but what I will say is one of the best ways to get children to eat their vegetables and to eat any new foods is to model it in our families. And that means both parents eating it and looking like they're having a good time eating it, any other care providers looking like they're having a good time. I've worked a lot with early care centers where teachers sit and have meals family style with the children. And we have some hard times with some of the teachers that don't like it, but they will put on a good face. And we say, you can't grimace. You cannot make a face when you're eating that vegetable in front of the child. Modeling is one of the best tools we have for almost any behavior, and this has been shown to be true for eating. More on vegetables. Greater variety encourages greater intake. So if you're able to serve 2 or 3 different vegetables at the meal, they will eat more of everything. And it's not just that there is a greater likelihood there'll be something they like on the table, because that's what we first thought, well, maybe, their 3 vegetables are going to like one of them. No, they will actually eat more of everything. And this effect works on any food. How many of you have gone to a buffet at some point? Buffet. So do you eat more at a buffet than you eat when someone serves you a plate? I certainly do. In fact, I think I've been eating quite a lot at the buffet at the hotel during my stay here. It's very tasty. But that effect, so greater variety encourages consumption, and often we want to limit that effect. So when we're talking about managing portions, we want to limit offerings so people don't overeat. But in the case of vegetables and children, this is actually a tool we can use to our advantage to increase their intake. I think it's fine to have family rules around vegetables and any food that you're serving. I make all my children have everything on their plate. I don't make them necessarily put it in their mouths. Sometimes I do. But it's not recommended you ever force a child to eat anything, but getting into the habit of just seeing it on their plate. We know from research in this area that if you put it on the plate, you increase the likelihood. Certainly if you don't put it on their plate, they're never going to eat it. But if you put on the plate and say no dramatics, you don't have to yell and scream and throw a fit, but put it on the plate, we increase the likelihood that they will eventually try it. And I will say also keep trying and be persistent. I'm going to show you, there we go, a data slide. This study, these data here, I'll step out of the way a bit, represent a study that I did with some colleagues on trying to increase vegetable consumption. How many of you have heard the idea that if you just serve it 10 times, it can take up to 10 tries to like a new food? How many of you have heard of that? Right. So we wanted to test this in a large-scale setting. We thought, well, can we do this in large nursery schools, large preschools? Could this be kind of a public health intervention? And so we did this study, and I'm sorry, the legend is not coming up, but these are 3 different vegetables. We have, oh yes it is, cauliflower, snow peas, and peppers. And we had each of the vegetables presented 10 times over a 6-week period with their regular lunch, and the children, were faced with these vegetables every time. We measured how much they ate. We measured how much they reported liking it. I think they were a little bored by the end of the study of these vegetables, but that aside, the reason I want to, and I will say actually that our 10 tries was not very effective. We didn't increase end consumption, and we didn't increase average consumption, but I want to show you this slide because this represents a pretty typical kids intake over the 10 tries. So each of these vegetables would try, and what do you see here? You see all over the place, right? Up, down, and sideways. So most of our children did this. On some days they felt like eating it. On some days they did not feel like eating it. And I show you this slide to say, just be persistent. Kids will vary in their interest, and just because they say no once is not a reason to not bring it back. Keep bringing back those vegetables. Keep bringing back your regular habits. So apropos to the previous slide, most children tried at least some vegetable every day. It was pretty uncommon for kids to refuse, so that's a good sign. And the other thing I will say is that consumption was predicted by the average consumption at the table. So we actually saw a pretty good peer effect. So if you have a good eater sibling at the table, that might help you along. And for those of you working in early care settings, you might be able to use your good eaters to advantage if you strategically place them around the room so that they are modeling for their fellow students. And I think this is a promising early intervention. I'm going to talk a little bit now about picky eating. I think we had some hands up already about picky eaters. I have 1 picky eater at home, 2 reasonably good eaters, and 1 picky. And some of you have, others of you have picky eaters. And I've been hearing during my stay that picky eating is not an uncommon problem here, so I'm eager to talk about it. I'll give you a few pretty basic facts about picky eating. First, it's most common among 2 to 5-year-olds. In fact, when we measure it in the United States and in some other what we call Western countries, so many of the European countries, 50% of children in that age category can be classified as picky, which seems like a lot. But, it's a time when children are developing autonomy, and sometimes they just say no for the heck of it, just to assert their independence, and it just is a fairly picky time. So one thing to know about your young kids is that most of them will grow out of this stage. You will get to about age 5 or a little beyond. Most of them will move on to being not so picky eaters, and I think that's helpful to know. If kids are picky beyond age 9, they're likely to remain fairly picky adults. This does not mean it's a lost cause, but they might turn into adolescents and adults who just have a more narrow palate than other people. It doesn't mean that they need to be unhealthy eaters. They just might not be very adventurous eaters. We certainly see what we would call clinically picky eaters, and I like to make a mention of this because there are a certain category of child who might have had some kind of history of oral motor problems, difficulty with swallowing, difficulty with chewing as a very young infant or toddler. And for those kids, we want to do a different kind of intervention, so that's not who I'm talking about today when I'm talking about the interventions we want to do. How does picky eating develop? As I said, children developing a sense of autonomy, they want to assert their independence. Pickiness is kind of heritable. So if you've got a picky parent in the family, you are greater likelihood of having a picky child. Role modeling and exposure. If your picky parent is being picky in front of the children, that sets you up with a more difficult situation. So one of the things that you can do is really make an effort as parents and caregivers and any of the adults, in the world of the child, if they aren't adventurous eaters, to try not to demonstrate that really loudly in front of the child and do your best to really role model, interest in a little bit of adventurousness here. What are the health? People get very worried about the health implications of picky eating. So far, for our normal picky eaters, not our clinical kids, but our normal picky eaters, the health implications are pretty limited. They might be a little bit lighter, or they might actually be a little bit heavier than their peers. We have seen that go in either direction. They might eat a little less, or they might tend, our picky eaters tend to eat what we call, how many of you have white food eaters? They like noodles, they like rice, they like white bread, and that can mean that they might be a little bit heavier for a period of time. There can be some social impact. So for picky eaters, when they're out and about, they might have, not be eating what their friends eat, and it creates a few problems there. The biggest implication is it causes a lot of family stress. For those of you who've had a picky eater, how stressful has this been in your family? Anyone want to volunteer? Very. Very is the answer, yeah. And every night can be a battleground. And just what do you do about this? So I would say that's the biggest health implication of picky eating. So what to do about, I thought I had a slide on what to do about picky eaters, but we've talked a fair bit. The kinds of picky eating strategies are just that we use, are the kind of strategies that we use to get children to eat healthfully in the first place. So, no one has actually studied this, but my belief about why we have so many picky kids in the US right now is I think we have a lot of choice. We have something going on in our families that we refer to as short order cook syndrome. Does this ring a bell? Do people know what that means, or does that sound very foreign? Short order cook syndrome. And what I mean by this is child says, I don't like this, maybe more than one child, maybe an adult, I don't like this. So parent gets up and fixes something else for the child for dinner. And by the time dinner is over, 4 different meals have been fixed for 4 or 5 different family members. Anyone have that experience? Does that happen here? I see a little bit of nodding. So I recommend not doing that. I recommend with picky eaters always making sure that there is a thing that they like on the table. It's pretty daunting to sit down at a table where you immediately hate everything. So a healthy food that is liked or tolerated, and then continuing the kinds of strategies I've talked about, which is let's arrive at the table hungry, so that we have a greater interest in just eating in general, which means not too much snacking before meals, really limit that snacking. Arrive with an appetite. Everything should go on that picky eater's plate. Doesn't have to eat it, but we need to get in the habit of everyone going on that plate. The rules are the same for everybody, so even picky grown-ups should have everything on their plate. And again, good modeling. And I know it's really tricky. Having one picky guy, he can make our dinner a nightmare. It's not fun. But if you persevere, for most of them, let me do something. There we go. If we persevere, for most of them, they will grow out of that phase. So if you can get through it and have rules about not having dramatics at the table, we have instituted that. You don't have to like it, but you don't have to tell everybody how much you hate it, and stick your tongue out and make spitting noises and gagging noises and all that kind of thing. And it's fine. I mean, it's the same setting limits around behaviors in any way. So I think those are some of the key strategies for picky eating. I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about physical activity. For young kids, physical activity is surprisingly tricky. People ask me, how much physical activity should young kids get? We don't have good data on how much physical activity very young children should get. We have it for older kids and we have it for adults. We have all our recommendations about how many hours, how many times per week, how many steps, et cetera, et cetera. For young children, it's a lot trickier, and one of the reasons for that is their physical activity is very different from that of adults. So children don't go out and run 5 miles or 3 and 4. I mean, that sounds like a crazy thing to say, but they don't go out and do these long runs. They don't do these consistent, sustained kinds of physical activity. They engage in these little short bursts of activity. It's actually really difficult to measure when you're trying to do studies on how active children are because of these short bursts. And we really have to work with kids in doing that. So we don't have very clear recommendations about exactly how much cardiovascular activity they should be getting. We do have better recommendations about what kinds of activity we should be offering to them. So we often talk about structured and unstructured activity, and we should have a combination of those two. What I mean by that distinction, structured activity is where an adult is kind of telling us what to do or setting the frame, maybe setting a game for multiple children to play, interacting with them, but really the adult is driving the train. Unstructured activity is where children are just doing their thing and being active. We might provide equipment for them, basic equipment, and by the way, really expensive equipment doesn't make kids more active. Pretty basic equipment is very adequate, so you don't need to spend a lot of money on this. But that unstructured is really important because it gives them that free play time, that time to use imagination. So we think about physical activity as not just impacting our physical health, but as part of development. And to that end, we also focus on different kinds of motor development. So when we're providing that structured activity, we want them to do that gross motor stuff so they develop their legs. We want them to develop balance. So if you've ever been looked at a good early care setting, they will do all these different kinds of things that let children develop large and small motor skills, that kind of thing. So we think about activity so differently for young children than we do for adults, and that's important to remember when we're thinking about how to be active with our kids. We have to get down at their level, so to speak, and be active as they are active. There is increasing interest in not necessarily teaching children. I mean, sports are great. I grew up playing all sorts of structured sports. But we want to teach children to develop the habits that they can carry with them through the lifetime. So many of us will not be playing lacrosse when we're 50. I grew up playing basketball and soccer. I am not playing those sports anymore. But I am doing things that can fit into, my lifestyle and hopefully will carry me till I'm, 80 or whatever number of years I live. And that's where we're starting to think about developing those early habits. So getting children interested in walking and running and just doing those kinds of things, swimming, those kinds of activities that we know adults can sustain for a very long time. Because if all they know are those sports that kind of end when they're 18, 20 years old, then they won't have those habits into the future. And finally, the best way to teach kids activity habits is to be active as a family. So this means parents, caregivers, grandparents, community members. It means you have to be active out there. And we do a lot of work with our early care providers. And this is not time for you to watch the children on the playground. This is time for you to really get in there with them. And they have a lot more fun, too, when the adults are really interacting. So this, again, is one of those family affair kinds of things. And try to have fun with it. Just as some interesting data, this is US based, so say it with a grain of salt, but I've seen these very, very similar findings coming out of England, Scotland, and some of our other Western countries. Proportion of time spent in various levels of activity. So let me orient this to you. We measured kids over a day of preschool. In preschools that had actually a lot of physical activity and time incorporated into their day. The blue shows how much time they were sedentary. That means sitting or not moving at all. The red is light physical activity. The green is moderate, and the purple is vigorous. So you can see the amount of time spent in moderate or vigorous activity was less than a half hour over the course of about an 8-hour day. And this, by the way, does not include nap time. So the sedentary is not including the time they were sleeping. So I show this to you because we often think, and one of the questions I raised earlier was, aren't kids naturally active? Well, apparently not. Kids, we need to provide them with opportunity. They won't necessarily get to those more vigorous levels of activity, and left to their own devices, even with that sort of outdoor scheduled activity time, they're not necessarily super active. I want to turn in the last part of talking about this, and I'm hoping we can be fairly interactive about this. No pun intended, as we're talking about screen time, which can be interactive. I want to talk about screen time. This certainly is a huge problem in almost all countries of the world, and I'm framing it as a problem, so I'll be interested in hearing your thoughts about whether you see it as a problem. But from a health perspective, we see that there are some problematic outcomes. I want to first define what is a screen. And when I'm talking about screens and children, I'm talking about television, but also movie watching, computer time, times they spend on the tablet, times they spend on your smartphone when you're driving them in the car. Am I leaving anything out? Every time I turn around, there's some new technology that we have not yet measured, but all of that kind of thing. So when we talk about screen time, we're talking about all of that. For children under 2 years old, it is recommended that they have no screen time. Is that surprising? Recommendation? Nope. Makes sense? You've heard that before. Okay, not new information. For children over 2 years, it's recommended that we limit this to no more than 1 to 2 hours per day, and this includes all screen time. So this is children 2 years right up through adolescence. How many know of children who are getting more than 1 to 2 hours of screen time in their day? Like everybody knows. Children like this, yeah. So we know that on balance, around the world, children are not meeting these limits. You know, I get asked a lot about should educational, quality educational programming or educational games or what have you count, and in fact, they are considered to count in this time. And we would recommend actually that very little screen time happen that isn't educational in some way, especially for our young children. I also get asked about screens as teaching aids. How many of you have seen screens used as teaching aids in your early care settings? What do people think of this? I'm going to take a little break and see if we can circulate the mic. What are people's thoughts about this or any aspect of screens? Yes.
I have 3 kids, and they're not allowed to watch any TV or play with anything that has a screen or electronic on weekdays. And I try to keep them as active as possible on weekends, so their screen time is very limited. I think that's very important, and I don't think kids should be watching TV for 2 hours a day. That's just serious brain damage.
Great. Other comments? Yes?
That was very hard to do.
Yes. That's an excellent add-on to that.
We don't have any screen time at our house either, but our children at school have smart boards in the classroom, which are great if they're used in the right way, but I've noticed that television is being watched towards the end of the day at school, which I am surprised by. So.
Right, okay. So sometimes teaching aids are brought into the classroom with the best of intentions, but they are maybe used in a non-teaching kind of way, and that can be the danger of having them in there. Other thoughts about this? Okay, well, we'll continue. Maybe there will be more thoughts. What I will say about screen time is that it tends to be associated with many negative outcomes. My focus has been on looking at obesity and nutritional status, and we know that the more screen time children have, the greater their weight, and actually that's true right through adolescence. So that is an important association to remember. I'm going to skip on to this next part and come back to the other. I want to spend now a little bit of time talking, in context of screens, about food marketing to young children. Here's a little bit of American data. American preschoolers, so these are 3 and 4-year-olds, see over 4,000 food and beverage ads per year on TV. A quarter of them are for fast food, about 15% are for sugar cereal, and the rest are filled up by some, various other food products. Can you tell me a little bit give me some feedback on exposure to marketing in your communities, young children? Where do you see children being exposed to marketing? Comment down here.
I'm American, and I would say it's much worse in the U.S.
Right.
Than it is here, what our children are exposed to, I would think.
Okay.
I think a lot of people use alternative types of TV here, so
Right.
they don't even get the regular ads that
Okay.
come in. I think
Okay.
that's common. I think in the stores, I think on billboards, a lot of print type
Okay.
ads, that's where children are getting them. And on the products themselves, when they
Okay.
get them, they're very
Excellent.
customized.
Great comment. And I think that's an excellent point. People say, well, how do I limit the exposure through TV programming? And one way is to use the devices that eliminate the commercials, such as DVRs and the other kinds of devices, if you're going to have your child to watch a program, to really try to eliminate the marketing. I want to talk, so why do we care about marketing? Branding and young children. Very young children recognize brands. And it is the case that actually Ronald McDonald is one of the top recognized figures by young children around the world. This is not just in the US, but globally. So branding has a really big impact. We know from many, many studies on marketing and branding that children as young as 3 will prefer foods in branded containers. So if you, for example, put French fries in a McDonald's container and French fries in a plain container, and these are the same fries, they will tell you the McDonald's fries taste better. And we see that effect across food. It happens with adults too, by the way. But I just think it's very telling that our children that are so young, our very young guys, we see that branding effect. children prefer the brands that are very familiar. And I think it's, this may not be such a problem for you, but this sort of unintentional or branding that happens when we are just not being thoughtful about our choices. We don't see these in a lot of early care settings, but I have seen them. So, M&Ms have made a counting book. So this is, again, an educational aid that's then advertising chocolates. Or these are I would not say they're popular in our institutional care settings, but they're very popular as a toy, the sort of McDonald's Playland food. And, we think it's going to be fun and isn't that cute and the kids will like it. But what we are doing is we are paying money to reinforce brand loyalty, which is kind of an amazing thing. So a word about that, just beware of that kind of unintentional branding. Branding through role modeling, I'll come back again to children learn what they see us do. So when they see us drinking out of these containers, and this just happens to be Dunkin' Donuts, which I did see that you have here when I was in the food court the other day, they will develop desire and liking for those products without even tasting them. So they will decide, and my children are a great example. Let's stop at Dunkin' Donuts. You've never had that. I know it's good. Why do you know it's good? I just see the signs. They're pink. They're fun. To speak to the, Dora on a drink, suddenly that's got to be tasty because Dora is on it. It's got to be tasty because it's the brand I'm watching my parents consume. So this is something that we're starting to understand, that they don't even have to eat that brand. They just have to watch somebody else have that brand, somebody that they admire, someone they have a connection to, and that branding happens. And I think that's something to be just very wary of when we're working with our very young children. And some care settings have taken the initiative just to say we don't have, for example, our teachers use these branded products. You want to bring this in, you get to put a paper towel around it just so we're not promoting that kind of branding. I want to say a little bit, we're bringing together some of the nutrition and some of the screen time information. Interestingly, something I think I didn't mention before is that we know that screen time is associated with increased weight. And I think we initially thought this was because, when kids are watching screens, they are just sitting there, and they are not moving, and they are not exercising, and that's why the increased weight. But recent studies have started to pinpoint the food marketing that they get through the screen time as part of why we see the increased weight. So we see those effects happening both ways. So again, to emphasize that any screen time that's happening, if you can eliminate the marketing and the branding, you are really eliminating one of the dangers of screen time, and I think that's important to remember. I have done some research on slightly older kids than the kids that we have been talking about today. More screen time seems to be linked with consuming more sugary drinks, and this is perhaps not surprising since we see ads for sugary drinks all the time. TV in the child's bedroom is linked with sugary drink consumption, and let me say a little word about TV in the bedroom. Do people see TV in children's bedrooms here? I see a little bit of nodding. I see some head shaking. Do you see it here? Well, I was shocked when I saw the U.S. numbers. What have I got here? 20% of 2-year-olds, 43% of preschoolers in the U.S. have a TV in the bedroom. I don't even know how that happens. Actually, we figured out how it happens is parents get a new TV, and then the old TV gets shuttled to a child's room. That's typically the process for that happening. But TV in the bedroom is even worse than just plain TV. So we highly recommend not putting TV in the bedroom, computer in the bedroom. TV in the bedroom means that the children watch more, obviously, because they have more opportunity to do that. It's not monitored, so you're not seeing the content that they're watching. And this applies to any screens. We recommend that parents are really tracking the content of online activity, tracking the content of TV viewing as well. And it is also very disruptive to sleep. So children who have TV in the bedroom tend to have poor sleep. This is not surprising since they're watching TV instead of going to bed. So TV in the bedroom is just really if we can say just never get one in that bedroom, you'll be a lot better off. And that screens, any kind of those electronic devices, you just have a habit of these are used in common areas. These are used where parents can oversee or caregivers can really oversee what's happening. So a couple of rules that and I'd like to hear your feedback on this and how you think this might be integrated into your communities. I would say screen time should never replace physical activity time. So we don't want children to be using any kind of screen instead of being, outside running around or inside running around or whatever they're doing. It should never replace face-to-face interaction with peers and adults. One of the big concerns about having more screen time with younger children, even educational, is that children are now getting teaching from a screen. and they're not getting teaching from people, and they're not having that opportunity to develop the social and emotional skills. Those of you who attended Dr. Nancy Close's workshop will probably have heard more about this. Just that's so key, and we, while that's not the work that I focus on, that's clearly a difficult issue with screen time. We should, as I mentioned, definitely limit exposure to advertising, limited to quality educational programming, and there's a lot of debate about what we consider quality educational programming. What's quality educational programming in your community? Do we never hear this term thrown about? If you think about what's a quality show that one would allow a young child to watch? What are some examples? Dora? I'm sorry? Sesame Street. I'll repeat, if we can't get the mic there, I'll repeat them. So Sesame Street has a fair amount of learning. Others? Sorry, I don't know Brain Pump. Yeah, I don't know. Brain Pop. I still don't know Brain Pop. I'll have to make a note of that. So Brain Pop, and what's educational about that? Okay. Okay, interesting. Okay. Other suggestions for what do you see as educational programming for young children? The Baby Einsteins. There have been big controversy over Baby Einsteins, I have to say, in the US, mostly about recommending it to babies. I think with older kids it's not such an issue, but again, it really promoted video watching of babies, which then turned out to be not a very good idea. But as a product for older children, I can definitely see that. Other products that people see? Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of debate about what you call, and I think, those who are big proponents of screen time and using technology tend to have looser definitions of educational programming than some of us who want to tighten up on it, and we have, stricter definitions of this kind of thing. But at any rate, you should make a decision and make sure it's something that your child will be learning something from, and not interfering with these other kinds of things. You know what? I think we have talked a little bit about this. And I think this is the end of my slides, and I want to leave a little bit of time for questions right now. So I'm going to end here as I just say a couple of words about this. What if my child is overweight? I guess asked about this a lot, and my recommendations are pretty much the same for overweight and thin children. Overweight children may need a little more help with managing portions. They may need you to ask them to check in on how full they are. They may need you to encourage a little bit more vegetable consumption, that kind of thing. But in general, we recommend making changes for the whole family, to come back to the idea of optimal defaults, making family changes, making community changes that really support everybody's healthy habits. I'm going to stop there so that we have time for general questions, any feedback, discussion, anecdotes that you want to share before we hit our end time. And I think we have a few people running around with mics.
I had a small question about the portioned plates that you showed in one of the earlier slides.
Right.
Fruit put in with the rest of the food, there's a notion saying that fruit ferments in this digestive system, causes bloating and things like that.
Sure.
Is it recommended to put in fruit with the rest of the meal?
Yeah, there aren't a lot of data behind that idea. It pops up every once in a while, but so far not clear data on a population level. Now, individual people can certainly discover that they might have a specific issue with fruit or with another kind of food, and that would be important to honor. But at a sort of population level, that the data don't bear out in that way.
Another question, if any studies, have you come across any studies, or have you linked breastfeeding into your studies at all?
Right, so I didn't talk about breastfeeding today, and I think it was covered in another workshop, but I'm very interested. Is there something, do you have some specific questions about it? I probably can answer those. Breastfeeding is certainly encouraged. It is the #1 recommended. Feeding for exclusively through 6 months, and continuing up to 1-2 years, however long one can do it. Can I say anything else about it for you, or answer a question?
Just if you could shed some light about the differences in kids growing up to become overweight, whether they were breastfed or formula fed.
Yeah, the data have been mixed. So, you know, there are some, this is one of those where there are some studies to show that formula-fed babies are more likely to be overweight, and then some studies that distinguish babies fed with bottles in any way, so whether breast milk is delivered through a bottle or formula, whether it's bottle-fed, do you see what I mean, versus breastfed, with the idea that bottle-fed babies tend to be encouraged to finish a bottle and tend to have more, so they don't develop the same kinds of capacity to just stop on their own. At this point, the data continue to be mixed. For a million other reasons, breastfeeding is recommended, certainly breast milk delivered in one way or another. That question of bottle versus breast, I think, is still new enough to need more data to answer it, but a very hot topic, and watch for continued data to come out. Other questions?
Yes, we talked about screen time. What about the the program? What are your thoughts about that program?
Yeah, so that's a great question. The question was about Wii, and does everyone know what a Wii is? It's that game where you're active with the computer. I think it is a really good device for children or adults, I suppose, who are not otherwise active. It's not clear to me that it shows benefits to move a child's, for example, outdoor activity to Wii activity. So for a kid who was already active and getting some benefit from different kinds of physical activity and the structured and unstructured that we talked about, and I'm talking about older children, it basically has not been studied in very young kids at all. So, but we're talking, you know, at least school-age children. So for kids who otherwise wouldn't be active, and we have some of those, I think it's a good move. It's not clear that it's a great move to move kids onto Wii. In fact, I wouldn't recommend instead of doing their other activities. Very good question. Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, have there been any cultural studies like in the Arab region? Because a lot of the issues that you were raising, they were all habits and traditions that were present previously. Family eating together, sharing a meal, the idea of peer pressure. You could only eat so much of a portion because it was actually shared between lots of people.
Right.
Have you actually looked into how you can reinstate older practices?
I have not, so the short answer to your question is no. It's an excellent question. You know, sorry, you're in a light that I can't see as well, so I feel like I'm not really talking to you. You know, the Arab region, especially the UAE, has undergone such a quick transition from older traditions to new. So I can't really speak to that from a data perspective. So I guess I don't have a great answer to that question. You know, it would be wonderful to see. So how to reinstate those? I mean, I think we get the word out. Say those, you know, family meals. Those are great practices. Not eating out. Those are great practices. I don't have any data-based further recommendations.
Yeah. And just, do you have references on like policies? Because I see a big problem here is that we don't have a lot of advertisements per se on TV,
right.
But the number of fast food places that are coming up, that's just amazing. So you don't even need to advertise, it's everywhere.
Right, I mean, they're their own advertising because they're standing there in their own advertising. So if you're asking about policies on restricting, for example, fast food restaurants. So there are some parts of the United States where there have been efforts at, usually through zoning, at saying no more, we call it quits on fast food, and no more are allowed here. And I think almost all of them have happened in California. So it's a hot topic. I only know to watch U.S. policy on this. And at every time there is a new policy enacted on this front, then the food industry sues the government and attempts to have that policy declared unconstitutional. So it's kind of in progress right now. But certainly there's policy movement and interest, and I would say keep watching if you have an interest on how those policies played out. And certainly we would like to see if those policies actually make a difference in people's diet. Ultimately, we want to know if we're going to go to the trouble of enacting such a policy. Does that make a difference in diet? And we don't know about that particular question. There are also some other policies that we are watching for outcomes, such as menu labeling, and that's been That's a policy question that's come up in the U.S. a lot, and so we are starting to collect data on that and some others. We have a little clearer data on some of the school-based policy interventions and some of the feeding program interventions.
Hi. I wanted to ask about the idea of having a
Oh, there you go. I'm sorry. I just want to make sure I'm looking the
sorry. Having a plate and, kind of telling your kid, okay, finish everything on your plate.
Yeah.
I was told that as a child, and I have like nightmares about finishing plates. So I don't want to kind of, send that signal to my child. I don't want them to think that they have to finish the plate if they don't want to.
Yeah.
If she doesn't want to eat, she doesn't want to eat. Whether
Yeah,
it's vegetables and healthy food, is that okay?
Yeah, agree 100%. It is actually recommended to not do that. And we call that, and many of us grew up with parents that said, you have to do this, and we call it the Clean Plate Club movement. Almost no one recommends that anymore. We do recommend that you have it on your plate. And that can be hard to swallow when you think your kid's not going to eat it. It feels like a big waste, and I get that. So I think we recommend have it on your plate. I sometimes even tell them they need to try a new food before they tell me they don't like it. You're not allowed to say you don't like it if you don't try it, but recommending finishing is, we never recommend finishing, so it's absolutely fine to, and that encourages children also to try to develop those internal cues that are so hard to develop in our world
So
today.
even if I have a toddler and she just doesn't want to eat at that time, then should I compensate with some kind of like a healthier snack later, or should I just wait and be like, no, you have to know that this is lunchtime, this is when you eat, and then this is breakfast, this is when you eat, and you can get, you know what I mean, like structured meals?
Yeah, well, so my recommendation about this is that you have your meal times, and people might be more or less hungry at different meal times, and that's fine. And also know that in very young children, there's a lot of individual variability, like within-child variability in how hungry they are on any given day. Children go through growth spurts where they eat a lot, and then they eat much less when they are not in the middle of a growth spurt. So rest assured that your child will not starve herself.
Yeah,
that's
what I
she
figure,
will not starve herself. I often, with very young kids, do recommend having a healthy snack. It depends on when your meals are spaced, but not going 6 hours without a meal. Like from 12 to 6, for example, would be a long time for a young child's body. So I would recommend having a healthy snack in there. But if the child doesn't want to eat much lunch, that's okay. That child might not be hungry, and then will be hungry at the snack. And if you've got a healthy snack, you can let her eat more of the whatever you put out for the snack, and sate her hunger there.
Okay, thanks.
Hi. Hello?
We have one down there. Oh, I'm
Hi.
sorry.
I have a question.
Okay.
Do you recommend a specific diet for kids who are ADHD?
Oh, that's such a great question. So I'll say that, unfortunately, this is not my area of expertise. I have read the literature on this topic, and it's very mixed. Lots of parents and teachers report anecdotal evidence that dietary changes make a difference for an individual child. And then and usually the dietary changes involve limiting sugar and limiting processed foods. Some parents report that they think their child is particularly sensitive to food dyes and additives. Those are not bad things to do for anyone. So I would say if you feel that your child or any child you're involved with seems like he or she does better when you limit sugar more, go for it. There's no way that will be harmful. The data across the larger data are less clear, and that may be because individual children have different sensitivities. So it may be one of those things that's harder to measure in a group way, or it may be that we just haven't measured it in the right way yet. So that's not a fantastic answer, but definitely limiting those kinds of things that tend to be the targets, in ADHD is never bad for any child. So, sure.
I work at a children's fitness club here in Abu Dhabi, and I feel that one of the main factors that affect children are their nannies.
Okay.
Here in this culture, we have so many nannies that watch our children. And if they're not educated, then like we do classes, so we have a class with children who are overweight, and when we're finished with our class, the nanny will be like, "Good job, here's some M&Ms, you did
Right.
such a great job." So I think it's really important for us to remember that we need to educate our nannies.
Right.
You know, just like parents being here, it's great, but we need to remind people at home on who's taking care of the kids, what is good and what's bad, and setting limits. You know, so that's really important on modeling. What you were saying.
That's
Yeah.
a wonderful point, and I think a great point to end on. I know it's our last question here, is that really this is about forming a community around our children where everybody who has responsibility for our children, and that in many families can be multiple people. It might be nannies, but it also may be grandparents or aunts and uncles. It's very common in many cultures that there are lots of people who have influenced food, and to make sure that everybody is educated and on the same page about the kinds of strategies and kinds of feeding that we want to do is very key. So thank you for that. I want to thank everybody. We'd like to end. I want to end on time and honor the time frame, but I'm certainly happy to be here for quite a period of time. If people have individual questions or just want to discuss or run any ideas by me, I'm very happy to stay afterward. Thank you very much.